When we hear 6-3 emergency ruling, it's easy to let the numbers blur together, to think of it as just another split decision in a long line of court cases. But this one isn't ordinary, and it isn't distant. This decision reaches directly into the idea of what it means to own something in this country, what it means to believe that what you earn, save, or build cannot simply be taken without a clear, fair, and transparent process. The fact that it came through the emergency docket is itself part of the story, because emergency rulings are not meant for slow-moving, abstract debates. They are meant for moments the court considers urgent, moments where delay is seen as more dangerous than speed, and that alone should make every American pause. For decades, asset seizure lived in a gray zone for most people. It was something you heard about in extreme cases, often tied to crime, fraud, or national security. It felt distant, almost theoretical, something that happened to other people. But what this ruling does is bring that power closer to the everyday citizen. It signals that the rules around when and how assets can be frozen, controlled, or redirected are no longer rigid lines carved in stone. They are flexible, and flexibility in government power is never neutral. It always moves in a direction, and that direction matters. The narrow 6-3 split tells us something important. This was not a consensus moment. This was not a clear, undeniable interpretation of the Constitution that everyone agreed upon. It was a divided court making a fast decision with enormous consequences. In moments like this, the margin matters because it reveals tension between protecting individual rights and empowering institutions to act quickly. And in this case, speed won. The court chose to act now to settle the question for the moment, even knowing that the full implications may take years to fully unfold. For more than 600,000 Americans, this ruling is being described as a victory, and in a narrow sense, it is. It secures a legal outcome that protects a specific group under a specific framework. But the deeper shift is not about who benefits immediately. It's about how the concept of asset seizure is being redefined at the highest level. When the court treats such authority as urgent and acceptable under emergency conditions, it reshapes the legal landscape for everyone else standing just outside that protected circle. This decision subtly changes the balance between due process and enforcement. Traditionally, the idea was simple, at least in principle. Before the government could take your property, there had to be a clear case, a fair hearing, and a strong justification. Emergency rulings compress that timeline. They prioritize action over deliberation. And while that can be justified in rare situations, each time it happens, the threshold shifts. What was once exceptional starts to feel normal. What was once unthinkable starts to feel possible. And that's why this ruling is historic. Not because of headlines or political reactions, but because it quietly locks in a new assumption that asset seizure under certain conditions can be treated as an urgent necessity rather than a last resort. Once that assumption exists, it doesn't stay confined to one case. Lawyers cite it, agencies reference it, lower courts rely on it. Over time, it becomes part of the legal bloodstream, influencing decisions far removed from the original facts. There's also something deeply human at stake here. Assets are not abstract concepts. They are homes, savings, ENISs, retirement funds, and livelihoods. They represent years of work, sacrifice, and planning. When the rules governing those assets become less predictable, trust erodes. People begin to wonder not just what the law says today, but how it might be interpreted tomorrow. And uncertainty is powerful. It changes behavior. It changes how people save, invest, and plan their futures. Supporters of the ruling argue that it brings clarity, that it resolves confusion, and that it protects legitimate government interests. And that argument deserves to be heard. Governments do need tools to act decisively, especially in complex economic and legal environments. But clarity for the state does not automatically mean security for the citizen. Sometimes it means the opposite. Sometimes it means the rules are clearer for those exercising power, while becoming more fragile for those living under it. The emergency nature of this decision also raises a quieter but equally important question: what die? Didn't get discussed? Emergency rulings limit debate. They narrow the scope. They leave less room for dissenting ideas to be fully explored. And when the issue is something as foundational as property rights, that absence matters. It means parts of the conversation are deferred, possibly for years, while the practical effects are already in motion. So when we talk about this ruling, we shouldn't only ask who won today. We should ask what standard has been set. We should ask how often this logic will be used again, and in what contexts. Because once the door is opened, it rarely closes on its own. It requires vigilance, public awareness, and a willingness to question even decisions that are labeled as victories. This moment is a reminder that constitutional shifts don't always arrive with sweeping declarations. Sometimes they arrive quietly, through emergency orders, narrow votes, and technical language. And by the time their full impact is visible, they are already woven into the cyst. At first glance, This ruling is being celebrated as a clear win, a moment where the court stepped in and secured protection for more than 600,000 Americans. And for those directly covered, that sense of relief is real. Legal certainty, especially after years of uncertainty, feels like safety. It feels like stability. It feels like the system finally worked. But the truth is, victories like this are rarely simple, and they rarely stop at the edges of the group they're meant to protect. The real impact of this decision lies not just in who it shields today, but in how it reshapes the rules for everyone else tomorrow. The language of the ruling matters, the reasoning matters, because courts don't just decide outcomes, they build pathways, and those pathways can be walked in more than one direction. What protects one group under a specific interpretation can, under a slightly broader reading, expose others to new risks. That's the tension at the heart of this moment. This is a victory IT guardrails, but guardrails that can be moved. For the people directly affected, the ruling sends a powerful message. The government's reach has limits, and in this case, those limits were enforced. That reassurance shouldn't be dismissed. It reinforces the idea that constitutional protections still have weight, even in complex and politically charged environments. But here's where caution enters the story. The same logic that secures protection here also outlines the conditions under which protection might not apply elsewhere. And once those conditions are defined, they don't exist in isolation. State governments, federal agencies, and regulatory bodies pay close attention to decisions like this. They study what arguments worked, what concerns the court prioritized, and where flexibility was allowed. Over time, those insights influence policy and enforcement. The result is a legal ecosystem where a ruling framed as a safeguard can also become a roadmap, one that shows exactly how AR authority can stretch without crossing the line. This is why uncertainty follows even a win, because while one group gains clarity, millions of others are left asking questions. Do these protections apply to me? Under what circumstances do they disappear? How narrowly or broadly will this ruling be interpreted in future cases? And perhaps most importantly, who decides? These questions don't have immediate answers, but they shape public confidence in the system. There's also a psychological shift that happens when the court draws a boundary so precisely. People begin to understand that rights are not always universal shields. Sometimes they are conditional frameworks. That doesn't mean rights are meaningless, but it does mean they can feel fragile. And fragility changes how people relate to the law. It turns certainty into calculation, trust into vigilance. Supporters will argue that this is exactly how the system should work. Specific cases, specific rulings, carefully tailored outcomes. And there's truth in that. Broad, sweeping decisions can create chaos. Precision can be a virtue. But precision also creates edges, and edges create exclusions. When the court protects one group explicitly, it implicitly defines who falls outside that protection. And that definition, even if unintentional, becomes powerful. What makes this ruling especially significant is the environment in which it lands. Asset seizure, financial enforcement, and regulatory authority are not shrinking topics. They are expanding, driven by economic pressure, technological change, and political division. In that context, every legal signal carries extra weight. Agencies are looking for clarity, courts are looking for guidance, and citizens are looking for assurance that the rules won't change overnight. This decision gives some of that assurance, but not evenly. It stabilizes one area while leaving others open to interpretation. And interpretation is where power often grows. A future case won't look exactly like this one. Different facts, different circumstances, different urgency. But the reasoning will still be there, waiting to be cited, expanded, or distinguished. And each time it's used, the boundary shifts just a little. That's why calling this a big victory is both accurate and incomplete. It's accurate for those whose assets, livelihoods, or legal status are now more secure. But it's incomplete because it doesn't capture the broader ripple effect. Legal wins don't exist in isolation. They interact with future disputes, future policies, and future crises. And in those moments, the fine print matters more than the headline. This ruling places the country at a legal crossroads. One path leads towards stronger, more clearly defined protections that are carefully extended over time. The other leads towards selective safeguards paired with expanding enforcement authority. Which path is taken won't be decided by this ruling alone, but this ruling sets the tone. It tells us how the court weighs urgency against caution, specificity against universality, and protection against power. For citizens, the takeaway isn't fear, but awareness. Understanding that constitutional outcomes are not static helps people stay engaged. It reminds us that rights are preserved not just by courts, but by attention, scrutiny, and public understanding. When people stop paying attention, complexity becomes cover and precedent becomes permission.